Been a bit ill yesterday. I think it was the stress of doing last week's episode.
Quote here is, I would love to see you do this again, which of course I'm devastated about.
It was a lot of fun. It was energetic.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sketch Wave. We are a week since we did our timed drawing challenge that we set ourselves. And I say we because I've, as always, joined by my co-host, the one and only James Julier. James, you recovered yet, mate, from the timed drawing challenge?
I've been a bit ill yesterday. I think it was the stress of doing last week's episode. So I'm feeling a little bit better now. But yeah, bear with me if I zone out. But yeah, I'm all good. It was good fun. I did actually enjoy it.
It was good fun, and it's something we're just going to kind of reflect on a little bit in today's episode. Take a look at some of the feedback as well, and then, as always, take a look through some of our recent tutorials. I want to get started by looking at some of the comments. I've got little sort of snippets from a few of the comments, so potentially if you left us one, you'll be read out. The first comment I've got here is from one of our members of the channel, and it's from Cockle. And the specific quote here is, I would love to see you do this again, which of course I'm devastated about. And then I had the thought that you could each set up a palette that you would share so that each of you could pick colors from the two palettes. So I guess this is one where we would have to potentially do a little bit of sort of preparation for, to a degree, or even just a generalized like palette where it's like blues of the bluey tones for water or sky, browns for land and dirt and trees and so on, and then some green tones.
It couldn't just be here's a palette, make a picture out of it, can it? Because that would just be could really set each other up for a disaster there, couldn't we? I think we'd have to negotiate that.
Have you seen those TikToks where, or like reels, whatever, where they make their iPad go into grayscale mode so you can't see any color at all, and then they randomly pick from the wheel colors, and then at the end they turn on the colors again on the iPad and see what colors they accidentally or purposely selected while they were in just black and white. So you're literally just using kind of grayscale tone. We could see that's maybe an iteration of it. That's kind of where we're going with this kind of show, isn't it? We're kind of spitballing a few ideas and just taking a look through the feedback. Yeah,
well, the channel's quite early in its conception, really, isn't it? You know, if anyone that's been here for the last, when did we start it? It's not quite a year yet, is it? It's over
not
6
quite.
months, though, isn't
Very
it?
close. Yeah.
And so we're still open to see how the channel evolves. I mean, it has evolved from the first few episodes, certainly. You know, we've had guests and we've had now a challenge that we did enjoy, and we're thinking that we should do more of this. And I could easily see this being a more kind of foundational part of what we do with the channel. It was a lot of fun. It was energetic, and it was, although stressful, it flew by, didn't it? You know, and I think that people enjoyed watching it on that basis too. So I think more. Well,
that's another comment. Is Miriam here saying that it was just fun to watch, and you know, shame about my screen recording not working, but the whole process was great to watch, and very definitely spontaneous. Which, you know, it was very, like you say, a little bit stressful on the spot in a sense from our point of view. Just trying to make sure that at least, you know, I was thinking the whole time, like, you know, we just need to make sure we produce something in this time. Like, you don't want one of the designs to get left behind or not keep up the pace enough that one of them, like I said, falls behind. So the pressure was there in that sense, just to get enough done. I think duration wise, I think it was like almost perfect for me. I don't think, I think we could have given ourselves longer, but it wouldn't have had the spontaneous kind of effect to it, and the fact of just getting some color in and just really cracking on with it. I mean, what do you think? Do you think you'd want to do it a little bit longer? Do you think you could do it? Because I only asked that question because in the same comment we had, it also says it could also be fun to do a version where you do the art off camera and then come back like an hour later. So giving yourself some more time. So that's something potentially we could do.
We could further develop the pictures and then see where we end up with that, couldn't we, individually, and then reconvene and see what we've ended up with. That could work.
Well, we should probably let viewers know a little bit, I guess, ahead of time for next week that's actually what we're going to be doing. We're going to be taking a look at the work that we created and going for it again. So just really going for it in our own styles, not under pressure in that sense. and just working it and not letting the composition really go to waste and seeing what we can come up with. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel for next week so you don't miss that episode and those kind of looks of it. Like I said, I think 35 minutes was just about right. It put enough pressure on. However, 5 minutes in the last two stages, I think, would have easily allowed us in just to get. You could have gone at the same pace, but then at the very end, just at least had a moment to step back and go, yeah, let me do this, let me do that. But I was really impressed with what we managed to actually produce in that time as well. It was. I don't think they were a million miles off. I think loads of things that we did obviously affected how it turned out, like flattening layers and everything like that. So there was softer edges everywhere, and you'd have to do a lot of sort of refinement, wouldn't you, in there if you needed to sharpen up certain elements, like the rocks, for example, in the foreground and so on. So yeah, I think it worked out all right in terms of duration wise.
I think
there's another comment. Go on.
I was going to say the stressful bit of it was the passing it backwards and forwards, and then you getting into the groove of one image, and then you have to swap it and change and then pick it back up and get familiar with it again, because part of it is spending a little bit of time and kind of getting used to what you've got to play with, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
Which was a good part of the challenge. But if we do more challenges in the future, maybe we could start off with a theme and then just do our own things and then show each other what we've created, but maybe stick with our own creation throughout. I don't know. There's different ways, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were just saying just before we came on that I saw a video of an art challenge. If I find it, it will be in my history, so I will find it. I'll leave it linked in the description down below of a channel that did another art challenge with a couple of other creators, and he integrated spinning wheels for different segments. So, like, as in to create the challenge. So, like, in their challenge, it was like reworking album artwork, and it was a matter of what decade is it, what genre is it, and then an item to integrate. And I was thinking, how does that work for us? How could we do it for that? Like, we could have the digital version of the spinning wheel, unless we've got some prop budget maybe, but the the spinning of the wheel could be, obviously, typically we tend to do landscapes, so it'd be the easiest thing to start off with and get familiar with it, and then
that's pretty much all I do, to be fair.
An object, yeah, that's true.
We're going to omit the portraits, aren't we? We're not going to do anything like animals and people.
I mean, I'm up for the idea of like a completely cartoon, like replication of an animal, like, as in, like, you could make a monster. We could have a monster week where it's all, you could do whatever you wanted, because then the rules, it's a lot like nature, like in terms of what you're saying, it's like there's a lot of room for error. If you decide that you want a slightly wonky eye on the other side, that's how we intended it, folks. That's what it was meant to look like all along. It's not a mistake, I promise. So I think something like that, where we give ourselves a bit of leeway, like you said earlier on, and the word perfectly summarizes it, it's just we want it still to be fun, to have fun together doing it.
Do you know what would be good? Like, you've had the doodle challenge that you have been working on. It would be good to give each other a kind of a shape, but not just a too simple a shape, but something that's already been worked on for maybe half an hour as a doodle of some sort, and then giving it to the other person to interpret that into whatever they felt. That could be interesting. It's something that's a bit more abstract and not necessarily obvious in what it's meant to be. That could be an interesting challenge too.
And we could share, if we ever did something like that, we could share the doodle with the audience and see what they come up with, which would be even cooler.
Idea too. Yeah, definitely.
Because then we could all get involved, and then we can review it the week after, and everybody's submissions, and we go from there.
There you go.
I didn't even realize we were recording. I thought we were just in flow state and brainstorming all the different ideas. Yeah, that would be really cool. I like the idea of that, and like, you could just create whatever you want and just see where it goes, any colors, any sort of lighting. And that's where I think it could be quite fun and expressive to just do something completely random and just a random monster or something. I always say monster because I feel like you can fit that into most doodle lines of shapes and be like, that's the shape of a giant headed monster.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Chuck some eyes on it. One question we had from Janine is, what did you and James learn? It was great that you shared with us what you learned. What did you feel you maybe learned from the challenge, if anything?
That I'm crap under pressure. Yeah, I don't know. What did I learn? that it pays to be a little bit prepared, doesn't it? You know, to have a color palette that you're planning to use. And I kind of know these things anyway, really. What did I learn? That's a tough one, really. I think because we do so many landscapes, there's not a whole lot I learned from it because we do them week in, week out anyway, don't we? So it's not exactly a new activity for us. The difference was that I guess without references and without a color palette already established necessarily, um, I think I learned that I am very much dependent on layers these days. In an image where we'd flattened it and we'd passed it back, and perhaps there wasn't enough time to change the background once you've already flattened it. Trying to change the sky in between the gaps in the branches is quite a challenge when it's no longer a layer that you can alter. And if the colours are a little bit off, you've got the whole image to try and adjust and play with. But I always knew that layers are really super useful anyway, which is why we use so many of them in our tutorials, isn't it? Really. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's about it. Did you have a takeaway from it?
My takeaway from it was I usually use the phrase, just chuck in the color. And I really felt like that was a really high pressure version of that, of just
Yeah,
like, you have no choice but to just bang, chuck some color in, a little bit of a lighter green then for the hillside on that right hand side in the landscape version
yeah.
when I was color blocking, and just, really just getting it in, and just like almost to a degree thinking less about it worked out quite well. And of course, like, luckily, we've got loads of palettes from loads of landscapes that we've created, or and those kind of natural kind of colors, so there was always a nice little sort of safety net to a degree with those.
Yeah.
But even still, to a point where we were just grabbing colors from the wheel and whatnot and the disc, just chucking it in and seeing
Well,
what
you started
happens.
off
Then,
with a color palette, and then
well,
halfway through
not
that, bit, you're like, "Oh, I'm using a palette." I,
yeah.
I was grabbing them from the wheel, trying to figure it out as I went. But yeah,
Listen, it
well,
was the first time. It was a pilot. We'll work these things out. But no, I must admit, it's just the top one was a palette that was very natural colored. And I was like,
yeah,
yeah, that's fine. I probably should have discussed it a little bit beforehand. But yeah, I think once you told me about you were using the disc, I tried to completely leave it alone. But yeah, just getting the colors in, not thinking about it, seeing what lands, and then just, all right, cool. Let me just change the shade of that slightly,
yeah,
or the hue or whatever, and just chuck in some more on top, and really not thinking about it. And it still worked out really nicely. And I think the
yeah,
only thing I would do, and it kind of the only takeaway to a degree, externally, somewhat from the actual canvas, is that I think I could group together like 12 brushes and realize that they're the only things I ever need and use. And
yeah,
they're just singular ones from different categories,
yeah.
like dry ink brush, the leatherwood brush, Aurora, um, soft airbrush, and so on. And I really think like it for us, it's an obvious thing because we've been doing it for so long. But over time, you really start to say, I don't need the gimmicks of a brush that is just this and just that and is kind of
Yeah.
stamp worthy in a sense. You work out what you like, and you don't
Do
necessarily
you
have to keep
Are you
changing
still not
brushes.
discovering qualities of brushes that are useful though, like different ones? I do find I am, but not as much as I think I've kind of landed on certain ones that I will keep relying upon, and I've explored most of them, but I'm still finding ways to apply some of them that I hadn't realized they might be useful for. Do you not find that that's still happening, or
I feel like for some reason, maybe in this current phase of all the work that I'm doing, maybe not quite so
right?
much exploration in different ones. I
You've
think
done a
I'm
lot
quite
already.
comfortable using a
Yeah.
lot of the dry ink brushes, and really just
Hmm.
going with that kind of style and just enjoying it. And also, I really do want to just lock in a little bit more on that. And
Yeah.
yes, maybe throughout the year, you will try and find like a slightly different brush for certain bits and
Sure.
integrate that into the work. But I really think I could easily just lock into 12, and that would be it. And I would know what the use cases are for them. I think that's the really tricky thing. And I love what you were saying there about, finding a brush and maybe tweaking a few settings like
Mm.
spacing or jitter and so on, the simple kind of things that might
Yeah.
make it very effective for like leaves or whatever it may be. But I think there's also being able to say, actually, no, these are my favorites. These are my go-tos, is quite nice to get to that point of being like, no, I think I've got everything covered now with these
Yeah.
sets of brushes. And then slowly but surely maybe integrating some more in. Because I mean, how often do you tend to switch in a new brush for something?
Um, I mean, we're going to discuss our more recent tutorials, aren't we? A little in a short while in this video. I do tend to find new use cases for some of the same brushes that I've already used. I've found that like the leatherwood brush in the past, I've kind of veered away from it, although I have used it in the last couple. Having said that, but it's been a while since I've used it. I've kind of not used it that much, and then I'll come back to it and find a new use for it. Um,
Mm,
I've used the burnt tree brush within charcoals quite recently, and I found
nice.
I've used it in a way that I've not used it before. You know, it didn't.
Do you want to
I've used
explain
it.
that one then? Is it in
Um,
your most recent tutorial?
yes, it is. Yes, with the kind of Milky Way in the background. That is the
Let's work
the
with
latest
let's work
latest
with
one.
that one then.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so this one, it's not obvious where I've used the burnt tree brush, but it's actually on the textures for the rocks. I'm still not
Hmm.
100% necessarily satisfied with rocks. I don't think I've ever found something that's perfect, but I found that it was quite a nice kind of grain to it. Um, and I'm looking at it close up now, and I still think it needs to be refined and improved. But I found within rocks that they're never just flat; they always have a texture to them, and even when they've got flat edges and angles to them, they're still going to have an underlying kind of texture to the surface. So I found that was really quite a useful brush to alternate, because in the past I think with rocks I've leaned into the airbrush and just tried to do the highlights on the rocks and not really focused on the texture of them that much. But I think I've realized in this tutorial that there needs to be an underlying texture to give it that depth and not make it look too plastic. Um,
Yeah.
I think when I've approached rocks in the past, and certainly when we did the challenge tutorials, those rocks were very plastically and kind of smooth, just the airbrush, because of the limitations of time. But now I'm a bit more confident I could approach similar kind of rocks in that way. So although it still needs refinement for a relatively kind of fast, efficient way to lay down a texture of rocks, that was quite useful, and then go over the angle and the highlights on the top to give it that flatness too of the top edges and those angular marks with the airbrush. But yeah, so the combination I found quite useful in this tutorial. And then other than
The
that, go
go
on.
no, Carol. No,
And
Carol.
and then other than that, it was the kind of rely upon the usual suspects, really. So it was it really was. And in terms of what you're saying, in having the brushes that you're used to and work for you, for me, it's the rainforest brush with the tree, and then it's the studio pen for the branches, because it's pressure sensitive and gives you finer lines the lighter you press, and thicker lines, which is perfect for me for branches. And then the luminance pen for the stars, and I think I use a bit of the clouds brush for the Milky Way kind of space texture, and then other than that,
Hmm.
it was just all soft airbrush and things like that. Oh, I did use the leatherwood, and you can't see it, but I used the leatherwood on the water. Just did really rough kind of horizontal lines with the leatherwood, and then just used the motion blur, which it kind of renders that texture unnecessary. But I just didn't know it was going to extend the motion blur that much, and I've actually used um, the leatherwood brush and not motion blurred it out to that extent, and I found it was quite useful. But it just gives you a separation of lines and a kind of texture that I think that can quite work. Because I think with a leatherwood brush, it for me it works really well when you go into the settings of it and change that spacing up, so all the little
Mm.
particles of the brush are more spaced apart, and then it's really useful for creating those little. And I might well go back into this for the extended one and further enhance the sense of ripples and individual little bits of texture on the water. Um, but other than that's it really. I mean, I think I was inspired by, because we discussed that you did a space one recently, didn't you? We looked at one of
Yeah, the
yours.
UFO.
Yeah. Um, we discussed about the idea of doing some nebula or space related things. So yeah, that kind of was in the front of my mind when I approached this one. So I wanted to do something that was familiar enough, but then it added that a different. I'm sure I'm trying to rack my memory now. I feel like I've probably done something similar in the past. Um, I lose track a little bit of what I've actually done without going scrolling through all the videos. You must be the same, because
Yeah.
although you've not done it as long, you do probably per week. What you do more tutorials, so you must lose track a little bit occasionally of what you've done
Yeah.
and what you haven't. But I enjoyed
Over
it.
350, I think, at the current
Yeah, right.
point. I think it would total over YouTube and Patreon, I think.
Yeah,
If not,
yeah.
well over, 350.
So it's a lot. You're trying to think back what you did. For me, it's more of the time thing, because what I might have done 8 years ago is kind of it's gone. It's not that I do that many per week, but when it's the addition of thinking back years and years ago, I forget sometimes what I've done and what I haven't. So I've probably
Yeah.
done something a little bit similar, but yeah, I enjoyed combining those kind of themes together. I was quite pleased with
There's
the
so
overall
many
result.
things in here that I really like the whole aesthetic of it. I mean, if I start from the top of it, the nebula looks awesome. I
Thank
think
you.
it's so easy with a nebula to get carried away and do too much.
Yeah.
Like it just like white blotches all over the place, too fluorescent kind of areas, too highly kind of bloomed areas almost, but having those different variations of the blues in the sky and some slightly more brighter and then slightly more purple like, they just look awesome. It's really cool. I love how I'm assuming this is my assumption, did you create like a patchy area of the stars and then just duplicate it all
Yeah.
over the place, or is that it's just relentless tapping?
I think there's no other way to do it, really. It's just a painful process otherwise, isn't it? It turns something that would be hugely laborious into something that you can be done within 5 minutes. So it's definitely the way. I will always do stars that way on digital now. I'll never do it any other way. So
and it's like it doesn't add anything either. Like if you can fill out that whole area manually, all you're doing is tapping with very low pressure and making sure you get a teeny tiny star. Like there's no skill to it to a degree. No. It's just sadly, even though it looks fantastic, it's just like filler, isn't it? It feels that you need to fill that sky fully to really pack it in and make it look really effective. It looks awesome. The use of these colors are sick, by the way, as well. Just like because they're very kind of they're like neighboring colors to each other almost. The blue into the purple into a little bit of that pink.
Quite muted,
very close to each
Yeah.
other, rather than going. I don't think you could get away with this with like a warm sun in behind there, or warm. It's not
Yellows,
sun, obviously, but that warm sky. I just don't think it would work in the same way. This is very pinky blue and purple. It just nicely aligns to each other, which is awesome. I love what you did with the burnt tree, by the way, and the kind of mid-tones of the rocks, because I'm looking at it and I'm going, there's enough information there with that tiny little grain of the burnt tree brush in there for me to understand that you're trying to convey that there's lots of detail to the rock. There's lots going on in that space, but I don't need to know every nook and cranny and crevice of the rocks, and it's enough that fills out the whole space with what looks like a boatload of detail as well. And you were saying about the usual suspects. The rainforest brush, for what you like it to use it for the leaves, it works. And there's no, unless you can find something that looks better, you don't just change it for the sake of changing it, do you? You keep doing what looks good, and
especially
you don't need to improve everything in a design. You can just do something somewhere else, like the burnt tree.
Especially when it's the silhouette. I think that you're looking for the outline. I struggle to find a perfect brush for leaves, and I have experimented with different ones, and I think the snow gum brush at different times. I'm still pursuing the perfect brush without resorting to creating one or finding or purchasing ones. I'm still trying to figure out how to use the brushes that are within Procreate. I'm wondering whether they'll expand their brush sets and include more variety of brushes. Yeah, I hope they do. I mean, I hope they don't expand it ridiculously, but just a couple more to cater for that kind of texture and category would be useful. And then everyone's got it then, as long as they've got an updated version of the app. But yeah, a couple more brushes would be useful for leaves texture, because although it does a good. I've had to find other tools and other methods when it's in like broad daylight to represent a higher number of leaves and other things. I find that the rainforest brush has a limit in terms of its ability to really capture that. But yeah, for the most part, especially if it's an element that's zoomed out and it's not too zoomed in, then it renders it quite nicely. I'm quite happy using that brush most of the time.
One thing I think would be really cool, and I don't believe it's currently a setting, but for something where we want to try and convey like a large amount of leaves,
Hmm.
is a setting that every time the stamp comes across, so the shape of the brush, there is also a randomness allocation to its height and its width.
Sure.
So you could hypothetically, if you just had a maple leaf, for
Hmm.
example, if it, as you're dragging it, occasionally they're really thin or really like squished or both,
Yeah.
you're going to get so much more variety to that scattering rather than just simply rotational kind of
Sure.
scattering. And obviously, pressure sensitivity as well could allow you to also have variety in sizing, but also to have that randomness would be pretty cool. I don't believe it's a setting as it currently
I've
stands.
not discovered it.
Um,
If it is, yeah. I don't
yeah,
understand half the settings in the brushes anyway. I kind of leave them well alone, or I've moved the sliders about and see what happens, and I've not noticed some of the sliders doing anything to the brushes. So I get a bit puzzled and lost with some of the settings. And as much as we're here as Procreate teachers, and this is what we do, there's a lot to the app that I don't use and don't really understand. Even still, I
yeah,
think you'd need to take a full almost degree course to understand every single element of it,
yeah,
but um and it didn't used to be that way. The app has really expanded and become, hugely complex and weighty in a way that it didn't used to be, which is good, for those people that understand all the different meanings of the settings. But I try to keep it simple, like changing the spacing or the jitter is a relatively straightforward. People can understand that, can't they? So just
yeah,
stick with that.
absolutely. Let's scroll down one more in our document then, because this will then take us to what was my YouTube release for that
Hmm.
week, which was my winter to spring archway. I've screenshot and put in our document the winter version, which is the slightly darker one, but I actually couldn't pick between
Yeah.
the nighttime version or the blues of the snowy kind of blue color scheme. I still, to be honest, I look at it and I think I prefer the dark one, but I still could easily just be swayed either way. And I think the comments were equally very scattered all over the place. I even sent it to you, didn't I, to take a look
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
ahead of it coming out. And yeah, everybody's. I think the sort of black dark one looks really nice because I think for me, it gives it. Winter is it's cold and it's dark, and for me, it's like
Sure.
that portal takes us through to the other side when the days get longer and the
Yeah.
we see all the flowers and the springtime and everything and the sunshine. So I think that's why I quite like the contrast between them.
I really
Um,
like the snow that you managed to capture. Somehow you managed to capture a kind of slush. I don't know what the correct word is for the snow that's kind of, it's not pristine snow, but it's what's is it slush? Am I thinking right?
yeah, it's like when
Yeah,
it's trampled down, very kind of wet, as if it's like rained on top of it as
it
well
has
to a
that
degree.
quality
And
to it. Yeah, which I think
yeah,
works really well. Almost
I think that
translucent kind of
comes
looking.
Yeah, I think that comes through a little bit more in this winter version, this dark
Right.
version. I think in the blue one, it doesn't look quite like that. Like to me, that
Sure.
does look like it's been kind of trampled into the ground, and
Yeah.
this snow could have been settled on like either a path or something like that, where you can
Yeah.
now see a bit of the tarmac through it or whatever it may be. I mean, truth be told, I think I'm not overly, happy with the snow in there. I think I wanted to keep it fairly loose and straightforward and like simple to a degree. And I think also the fact that there was kind of two worlds to try and fit into one design and wanting to keep
Sure.
both simple for duration and stuff. Obviously, like I've done snowy ones, which we did over Christmas, and I was really happy with the sort of the styling of them. But this one, in the end, I think the snow would be something I would completely revisit and do it again. But I mean, the concept's there, and maybe like in the future, I'll revisit it and just do it
Yeah.
again and see what I can do a tiny bit different. But all in all, I actually, as a whole, and a concept and like I think a concept really summarizes it. I quite like the idea a little bit, and
Yeah.
we were saying about kind of fundamentals of the sketches we did when we did our drawing challenge. Having that path just take a user from right in front of us, but
Yeah.
all the way back, and then out of the portal, out on the right hand side, just takes you through into the world, and then disappears, and you're just left with the green, luscious hillside. So I wanted to keep it a little bit paintingly, like especially inside there. I did not want to be detailing a world in there that was too heavy.
Sure.
I always think I don't know when I've done this before, and I'm trying to rattle my brain, and this is where now I'm struggling to think back about all the content been done before. But I think I did something regarding two worlds before, and it's the same thing that if you want to detail both heavily, it just a lot of palette to do both potentially, depending on what you want to do, and the detail and the time, the duration just racks up like crazy. So yeah,
I really like the way
it did okay on
the
YouTube.
glow
Did
of
okay.
I really like the way the glow of the spring is reflected on the stonework as well. I think that element I really like as well.
Well, I really wanted to show the sunlight just there, like there's beams of light that are very, very faint coming through. I really wanted to emphasize that the things like I said, we associate with spring, and just the brightness, the sunshine, and just there's almost. I think you actually nailed it a couple of weeks ago, where you sort of referred to one of your tutorials as saying like you wanted to kind of give off some positivity in it, and I think this is exactly what I was going for in terms of the concept of it, of just making sure trying to show like a lot of people struggle with winter, and maybe this helped them to understand hold tight, and spring is just around the corner, and we'll be seeing that sunshine soon, and it won't be quite so dark, and
hopefully
we'll come out of it. Yeah, hopefully. I mean, you live in Yorkshire, so it's always grey. So
it's grim up north, they say, don't they?
I'm going to scroll down one more in our we usually have a document set up that's ahead of time, so that's what we're referring to. Before we scroll back up to the top, this was a tutorial that I released on Patreon, because we haven't done this for a couple of weeks. We've actually got quite a few to look back through, but I'll kind of quickly gloss over this one. This is the third one in what I referred to as my wet landscape collection, which was heavy use of like the wet brush, I think it wet sponge and so on for smudging, and like we're way up in the clouds, and really enjoying that. And I think it's like a Japanese or Chinese ink style designs. Like I really like them. They're just beautiful designs, and keeping it, to a degree, keeping it really simple, but for me, aesthetically pleasing. Like the tree and all the little sort of dashes for the tree, completely different to what, for example, the rainforest would give you. These are all manual to a degree, like, and having to get in there meticulously and do all of them, but gradually getting smaller. So you just detail a little bit more and a little bit more. And then also having the luxury of being able to say, right, I'm going to focus on that foreground element and the rock up out of the clouds and the pathway and the stairs, taking you up to the summit. And that's it. I mean, a tiny little bit more with the trees in just behind it in the second tier back, and then the rest of them are just slightly more faint as they get further away, more blurring. And the fact that the palette is just like almost singular, that there's just the red against the background. There are yellows and pinks that you can see kind of dashed in the middle, in between all of the kind of hills, but keeping it really simple and just for me, this was probably my favorite out the three of them.
It's my favorite to look at. To look at.
I think it's just the mono palette. I think what draws you to this one that's different than to the other two?
Maybe just compositionally. I think that it looks probably the most authentically traditional version of the series. But I also think the way it blends into the clouds and disappears underneath the atmosphere just seems to be really elegantly done and nicely transitioned there. I think it works. But the rocks are really good too. I think you've really nailed the kind of that aesthetic of the rocks of the main tree there. It looks great.
Thanks. There was a very limited amount of kind of shading to a degree and highlighting, but that's all you needed. I think I went a little bit further with the shadow color and a little bit further with the highlights in terms of exaggerating them a bit more. And then that nicely actually gave us quite a nice amount of contrast there to make it quite aesthetically pleasing to look at, and just the same usage of the colors on the steps as well. It's quite, it's just nice. I just find it very, what's the word, I guess, just very pleasing to the eye to look at. And there's loads of things in there I equally love doing quite frequently, is like putting a border around the edge. And I love doing this where I set the background color to the canvas, and I'll have everything going on in the scene, but then I'll trim the edges as if it's like masking tape in real
Sure.
life that's been peeled off the very edge to leave like the edge
Yeah,
of
it's
the
nice.
canvas. But because the top of the scene in the sky doesn't have color in it, it really like pleasingly just runs out into the border, and
Yeah.
there's no division there. But the division is on the right hand side where you can see the red of the sun and the
Got you.
black of the hilltops, and the bottom of the scene with some of the grays of the clouds. So it's like in some areas it's really prominent and you get that kind of square bordering, and then in other areas you don't need to know because it just blends out into the rest of the scene. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's an effect that I usually love doing. So we'll scroll back up to the very top of our document because we've got a two-parter of your YouTube tutorial of your big beautiful mountain.
Sure. Well, it's kind of the same image, isn't it? The two images. One's the YouTube
Yes.
version, and one is the extended version that is over at Patreon. So yeah, I wanted to revisit something really vibrant and that kind of anime Studio Ghibli kind of really vibrant color palette again. Um, it's something I will always at different intervals just return to as a kind of aesthetic. And you can't, I don't think you can ever get sick of painting mountains scenes, really, can you? And those vibrant green colors to go with it. So yeah, it was one that I really enjoyed kind of redoing. I've not done one exactly the same as that. They're always a little bit different. um but yeah, I guess it's kind of like very, very obviously kind of Japanese kind of Mount Fuji kind of, referencing here. um
Mm.
but yeah, I tried a slightly different brush for the clouds as well. Now I've already forgotten what the brush was. Gosh, that's annoying. But yeah, I've already forgotten what the brush was. People, I just have to go and watch it. Oh well. Yeah. So that was interesting because it's much more blocky and stylized than just using the clouds brush or the soft brush or whatever other brushes I might use at different times. It was a very much more blocky and stylized kind of aesthetics of the clouds, which I quite enjoyed the look of overall. And yeah, it was just one I really enjoyed. Taking the greens, it's an obvious kind of color perspective ploy is to have your really vibrant greens in the foreground, really yellows and warm greens, and then as you get further away, you get more blue greens.
Hmm.
Um, but I love an opportunity to really show that because I think it's such an effective way of creating that distance. So yeah, I really enjoy doing the warmer colors in the foreground and the cooler colors in the background, and it is straight kind of from the textbook kind of version of that. But I don't think you can go too far wrong sometimes with that kind of cool in the background and warm in the foreground look. And I know
No,
yours, we'll come to yours
always
in a
very
moment.
pleasing.
It can be different depending on the sunlight. So thinking in a situation where you've got a strong warm glow of the sun, then that completely messes around with that idea of having cool colors in the background sometimes, can't it? But in the
Yeah.
case where it's the middle of the day and you've got the sun high up above you somewhere, or it is that absolute daylight, then you'll get bluer colors in the distance, and it works really well with mountains. And I also love doing snow. So I've done obviously a lot of winter scenes, and I'm not quite ready to let go of the snow theme, although it's clearly not winter in the scene. We've still managed to creep some snow into there nevertheless. And I love doing the snow in the variations of like in the shadow part of snow and the highlight part of snow. I just love the contrast. I think it's quite, I wouldn't say easy because I don't think mountain snow textures are easy, but it's a satisfying um, effect that just comes together at that point once you start adding the white in there and then start adding the blue for the shadow part of the snow. That contrast just pops and really, I think it really helps emphasize the idea that it is one element in different kind of lighting conditions.
But what's
And
really effective here is that you didn't just essentially draw a line straight down the middle of the mountain and say, this is
no,
the shadow side, this is the snow side. On that snowy side, you've put white on top of the blue where the light is just creeping round. And
yes,
it just changes the whole canvas of the mountain where in my mind now it kind of swoops up on both sides, and then we've got this big crevice in the middle because you've
yeah,
highlighted a side that sticks out a little bit more.
that's it, yeah,
And to me, there, when I see somebody do a mountain like this and you've got the cool shadow version of the snow and the white of the snow, it's how they go about doing that that really showcases how much you sort of unevenness to the ground that you can make, and that's where I think the
Sure.
skill really comes into it more so, is trying to show those two sides can they're not flat to each other, like I was
Yeah.
saying. You know, you're not drawing that straight line down it.
I think having a concept of 3D shape in your mind is really useful for doing elements like that, because it could so easily just be completely flat and just be very much a caricature of shadow side and light side. I think that when you're adding abstract textures, and they just seem like blobs and streaks and bits of texture on the snow, you've really got to try and imagine you're a little character there. I try. This is the way I tend to. My imagination works. You imagine you're a little character and walking up there, and would one bit swell up and another bit dip down. I think you've got
Hmm.
to try and visualize and almost in an experiential way. If you were there, what would the terrain be? And it's not if it's not going to be completely flat, which bits are going to raise up, and which bits would be difficult to navigate, and therefore if it sticks up, is it going to catch the light, is it just going to creep around that edge a little bit? And I think that exercises and really just trying to use your imagination, looking at it and trying to figure out what it would be like to traverse that terrain, and I think it can be useful to try to understand it in a 3D sense. I think that a lot of the times, because we're painting or drawing 2D images, that we almost leave out the 3D conception of it. And I think to try and think of an image in 3D is a really important part of what we do. Um,
Mm.
and it's difficult to explain it too, because it's something that you can only do internally, really. It's not something that
Yeah.
happens on the canvas. It's something that you can only bear in mind in your own imagination. And I think it's a super important part of it. I know whenever I'm doing any kind of artwork, I think I get to a certain point and I block in the main light and shadow, but then I try to. I'm trying to. If I'm trying to make something look 3D, I'm trying to already imagine it is 3D there, and might therefore imagine almost like closing one eye. Therefore, you'll get a 2D version of it, but you're then trying to imagine if it was real, what's not looking right about it. I think you can get hung up on the 2D-ness of it, and then just try and. I've rambled on for about 10 minutes about
No,
3D
no.
elements now, but um, yeah, I think it's an important exercise is to just picture yourself in the environment and think how would it be if in terms of 3D shapes. Yeah.
But also, it's quite tricky, isn't it? When if you've blocked in the what I would always refer to as the base shape of that mountain, just a general shape with the base
Yeah.
color of whatever you set it to be, when you're just looking at a blue mountain-like shape, it can be hard to take a look at that and say, where is the deep, like where is the terrain? Because all I'm looking at is a blank area. I have to
Yeah.
manufacture and come up with, yes, that's the peak, but then in front of that, are there any sub peaks like
It's
in that
true.
space that are slightly closer to camera,
Yeah.
or the person, whoever, however people imagine this kind of scenario, and then how does the snow come from the top, and then how does it interact with the peaks in front
Yeah.
of it? How does the land flatten and then steeply fall down again? And are there flat planes at there's all these things to try and think of. But again, when
Yeah.
you're looking at that base shape, you're like, where do I begin? And I think sometimes in my own work, when I'm not doing a tutorial, I will look at it and I will create a separate layer and just sketch it and just see what comes up with, see what shapes I like the look of.
Yeah.
And then I might start to actually integrate the blue and the snow to see how it falls. But having
But
at least a zigzag line to follow to say,
yeah.
okay, cool, that's the ridge lines for me to follow is really
Mm.
important.
But also bearing you have to think about nature and the way it works. You have to think about how snow would settle into those dips and crevices, and if the light is getting. I think in this case it looks fairly evenly spread, but in some mountains there'll be little crevices where the snow will never thaw out, just because it's deeper and the light will never get to it, therefore it'll never thaw it out. So it gives you a sense, if you run like a section of snow down and it reaches the ground, therefore it must be a deeper crevice that it sits in. And so you have to try to imagine that, how the elements would actually respond to the shapes that are there in front of them. There's a lot to take into account, isn't there? I think the more that you do this kind of subject, that the more you get your head around the idea of how things actually work. Um,
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is understanding how things work, and it is just a drawing, but underpinning that there's logic, isn't there? Usually with these things, I think that people might not necessarily don't have a lot of experience of drawing, think that somehow it spills out of you, and it's almost like an instinctive thing, and it isn't a lot of the time. It's
Mm.
logically understanding why something should be the way is the way it is. Um, and yeah, and then with this image, we've got the extended version as well. I felt that I knew when I was doing the YouTube version that I was probably not going to have enough time um, to add the trees that kind of frame it. So I deliberately left that to the extended one, and then I've kind of in the original one, there's only really distant trees, and that's about it. And then I wanted to add some middle distance ones on the left, and then
Oh,
some
yes.
more
Yeah.
foreground ones as well. So there's not a great deal that's different other than that. A couple of stones on the ground, but the overall feel of it is quite different. In terms of it revealing a landscape through almost you can imagine being in a wooded area, and then you arrive upon that scene. It's a different feel than the first one, so I wanted to change up the composition of it with the extended one, which I was quite happy with in the end.
There's something about that aesthetic that I absolutely love. That kind of, you could imagine somebody's just on a trail walking the dog, and then there's a break in the trees, and you just
Yeah,
look through it, and that's what you see. And I think sometimes when you have that framing of exactly how you've done it in the extended version, that's the magical version to me. That's the one that gives me the full story. Like the
yeah,
other one, it doesn't have that kind of, like, as it, like I said, that storyline to it, but as in
sure,
like the it's the break in the trees that makes it. Do you know what I mean? As in,
yeah,
it's nothing that the YouTube one's not doing correctly in any way. If anything, I'm looking at the YouTube one and I'm imagining I am like in this like very flat plane of
yeah.
land, and like, and we have full view of this entire beautiful scene, but it's
That's it.
almost like I imagine the land is really expansive, really flat, whether or not you are on your porch or whatever looking at this kind of thing from your house, that kind of openness to it, but the closeness is that kind of little peek through the trees, and
Yeah, I
that's
think
one
it
that
works
always
better.
leans closer
Yeah,
towards me a little
yeah,
bit. The one thing that nearly caught me out with this one, I thought you'd integrated a very small like waterfall in ish at the bottom, and it's not that at all. It was just the reflection of the mountain.
it's
However, the
true.
way that the lines all slope and swoop, it's as if they are, it's
I
like a
can see.
waterfall in a curve shape kind of pointing
Yeah,
down,
yeah.
and I was like, oh, that's really, and I was like, no, that's not it, Joel, that's a reflection.
I could see
It's just
that
like,
that would be an interpretation. Do sometimes I struggle with the reflections because sometimes reflections are a bit tricksy, aren't they? Sometimes you feel like you have to condense them a little bit, so
I do that.
and I did do with this, but there wasn't enough water remaining in order for it to condense it enough to show the sky still. So
Mm,
I wasn't. It was one of those elements that I needed to show the mountain reflected, but I would have liked more sky in the reflection too. But I couldn't think how to do it. And the truth is that actually, probably because getting a bit technical now, but because the mountain slopes away from it, maybe you wouldn't get as much as in the reflection. Um,
mm,
it's hard to grasp sometimes. Like if it was a flat, like a flat board, a picture of a landscape, then it would reflect perfectly, wouldn't it? Mirror, mirror. Um, you know, it would be like that. But because the top part of the mountain is recessed and goes further back, maybe it would have way more dramatic foreshortening of that reflection because of that. So
mm. But that depends on your vantage point, doesn't it? Of looking, you'd need to be making sure you're looking down at the reflection like you are to
mm,
compress that in that exact same way that you were saying, because you wouldn't, yeah, like you say, it gets quite technical of
yeah,
the tip of the mountain gets heavily squished down. But again, that's only if, I think if you're slightly higher then, isn't it? If you're looking down
sure,
on the
yeah,
reflection to a
yeah.
degree.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I
Well,
just thought I just kept it as it was and squished it a little bit, and that was that, But I can see the limitations sometimes of using that as a technique because not all reflections behave in an obvious way. So yeah, but yeah, I was quite
yeah.
pleased with that. I think if we move on to your tutorial, it's a YouTube one, is it? Yeah,
So
Seen
which one
this
are we
one.
looking at? This the one with the tree on the left and the waterfalls, the
Yes.
two of them.
Yeah.
And this one's on Patreon. This
Patreon.
was a Patreon exclusive one, yeah.
So I
And this
think that
just
in some ways it
God,
has some similar elements in terms of you thought mine had a waterfall. This really does have waterfalls in it, doesn't it? But in terms of what I was saying before, in terms of that warm glow in the distance is absent in my one, but this changes the color.
yeah,
Not completely, because I know I'll leave you to talk about it in a moment. But then you still have a reduction in the vibrancy of the greens in the background, don't you? But it is bathed in a warm glow, so it gives it warmness,
yeah,
but you haven't got the same zingy greens that you do in the foreground with it. So I'll let you
yeah.
talk about it.
No, you're absolutely bang on. I mean, I always loved the idea of a low hanging sun in a scene.
Yeah,
I prefer the warm glows. It's just, I lean closer towards it. I like to have I don't know if it's just like my thing where I need to see the light source in scene to understand it to a degree. I worded that as simply as I could without getting too
yeah,
into it, but I like to know exactly where it is to understand then the
sure.
side effects of it and on the rest of the scene. But this one, it's up there with one of my favorites.
Really nice.
It just gives me such a warm tropical kind of location with the waterfalls, especially. And it's something it repeats a lot of things, and it's in another tutorial that I've just recorded this week, which is in a similar kind of vein to a degree. And there's things in there that if I could draw whatever I wanted to draw absolutely every single week, it
Yeah,
would almost be like this every single time. I love integrating like a dirt path in there, and then like how I don't know, a tree root might be making its way across the path,
yeah,
and so therefore you end up with a really nice bright sided top to it, but also a little bit of a groove and a dent in the kind of flat earth of the path. I love brightening them up and just giving them that kind of pop of the sunlight, equally using the Aurora brush to create lots and lots of tiny leaf-like kind of vegetation, and the
yeah.
dry ink brush to create blades of grass running through those bushes. And again, I've said it in the most recent recording I did, and it's almost like I've created like a bit of an environment that is maybe it associates to some real plants. I don't know. And truth be told, I don't really care. In my world, it's like a slight kind of, it's a plant that's just been allowed to just grow. Grass is growing through it, and
Yeah.
that's all. It's like two of them together, and I just love the unnatural kind of factor of that they've just been left to grow naturally, and they happen to be running through one another, and I love the effects of it and how it
It's
all kind
almost
of
like
works
a
out. I mean,
it's almost like a type of heather or something, isn't it? It has that kind of look. It's really nice.
mm. It's just, I just find it very fun to do. I find it very pleasing to
Yeah,
draw. The paths, as I said, just getting in there with a leatherwood brush and just adding tons and tons of texture, then just using the soft airbrush to introduce some shadows. Then that gives me the locations where I put the highlights on top of those little grooves and dents. This one was all equally quite fun because I had to try and also understand like very bottom left of the design. Those like bits of greenery are not in the sunlight at all, and you have to still
yeah.
continue to pull off that silhouette effect. So they're very subtle in the very, very bottom left corner of the design, like really light green, faint green, shall I say, in there. But it's like little things like that just continue on the whole design. And this is one thing I've really noticed a lot compared to the two of our designs that we did in our challenge, is that I lean so much more towards heavy contrast and
Yeah.
heavy highlights and shadows more so than yourself typically.
Yeah.
It's just something about dark and like having a very deep dark base color for kind of the hedges
I
and
think
stuff and the areas, and then layering on the color on top and leaving the dead zones inside where there's no light
yeah.
touching.
I think I do lean more naturally towards that too, but I think that I did quite a lot of that earlier on.
Yeah,
And I feel that I've maybe lent too much into that, and so I tried to do a few more broad daylight, because it's like you say, when the sun is low hanging, and you get those sun set or sun rise kind of lighting situations. I think they're the most interesting lightings and the most dramatic. Um, but yeah, maybe it's time I revert back to doing a few more of that type of lighting. But I did it was a period where I felt like I was doing them all the time, and then I felt like I had to do something more in uh, the height of daylight. which it changes things. It's not quite as romantic, and I do think that the interplay between object and light is more interesting. The little kiss of light on the top edge of things, just revealing those little top highlights. Like, for example, the really vibrant green, the top part of the canvas with the branches that hang over the mountain there, and you've just got some kind of real kind of lime greens in there, yellowy
Yeah.
greens, which just make it, and that kind of contrast doesn't happen when it's broad daylight quite the same way, does it? So I really like the warmness and then the dark coolness. That contrast is really nice.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, this one was one of those, again, those silhouettes of a kind of mountain-like rocky structure in the background, and you have to work out how does that land work and flow. Where is that kind? I
Yeah,
know I sort of joked about it earlier that if you've got a triangle and you've got a straight line down the middle, one side isolates the highlighted side and one side isolates the shadow side. But in there, you also want to think, can it curve slightly at the
yeah,
bottom? Can it wrap round in a different way? How much of the light is kissing onto the forest and like almost like very tropical kind of rainforesty kind of dense jungle like area towards the bottom?
yeah,
And then just one thing I really enjoyed about it was the simplicity of how I tried to integrate that waterfall in the main big rocky structure at the back, because it just worked out that I just left a blank space where I didn't do anything. I just drew a horizontal kind of whitish line, very low opacity, and then did all the drape lines down,
yeah.
and then just engulfed it a tiny bit with some greenery of
Does need a
some
lot. Yeah,
trees. And that's it. And it was
yeah,
just simple to do. And I think about the thought sometimes of integrating a waterfall, and I'm like, no, it's a bit too. Is it another complex element to introduce? But when you keep it as simple as that,
yeah,
it's really sort of straightforward to do. And there's lots of things in here we've actually kind of spoke about in terms of, like, you mentioned the leatherwood for the ripples of the water. Well, this is actually there was a lovely gradient of like blues, greens, and yellows of that water, the main
yeah,
pool of water, and then um, smudging left to right with the leatherwood brush and it dragging out that color across, but in a nice
yeah,
scatter effect on top. It works so well, especially if you keep it really, really small. Yeah, very pleasing. One thing I tried to do, and I guess maybe I love the word you used just then of like the romantic kind of side of it, is the pool of water that then trickles over the second closer waterfall. It's got a bit of a more browny, as if it's shallow and doesn't have that kind of dense blue lagoon style
yeah, yeah,
water to it. This is streaming off into like a somewhat muddy kind of area. So there is a lot of brown hues in there as well. Maybe it's more realistic potentially to do so and have it look a little bit more like that. But yeah, one of my favorites that I've done. And like I said, if I could draw something like this all the time, I would do. The just a quick note on the texture that was on the top of the rocky area of the big mountainous area on the right. I think it was a use case of like 2-3 colors for the shadowed side, 2-3 tones for the
yeah,
highlight side, and just kind of roughly putting it in. I can't remember what brush I used at the time, but then I just created a layer on top that is the same as the base color for the whole object, and just run a dozen lines through every single element
cool.
of it to create all these just deep line cracks, and just went to town on just creating like
Works.
this
Yeah,
complete like non-flat car. We're recording this a day later than normal, and I'm just absolutely shattered. So I'm trying to get my words out, and my brain's not functioning. Yeah, just loads and loads of lines in there to show how like it's just not a flat, easy object. There's lots of granular, rocky areas in there, and it was the simplest way to actually do it. And I was really happy with the effectiveness of how it
yeah,
pulls off exactly that texture of making things look really, really rocky, and just not having to purposely sit there and draw out each rock. It was just the simplest way of doing it, and it would be a technique I definitely use going forward for sure.
looks
I
great.
think that's all of them, isn't it? I think that's all of our
We're up
tutorials
to
that we've
date.
looked back through with. Yes, we are up to date, and we can take a look at it. We're very close to the hour mark, which is a perfect time to probably wrap it up,
Yeah,
and we can take a look at how we get on then with trying to see what we do potentially with the designs of our challenge. But make sure you are, as I said, subscribe to the channel. so you can go ahead and see what we come up with for next week's episode. As always, make sure to check out all of our socials in the description down below. There you'll also find a link to the join button. We've got half a dozen members now to the channel who get early access to the show, as well as potentially we'll do some exclusive stuff potentially in the future. But you also get a loyalty badge beside your name currently that grows over time the longer you are a supporter, and you can flex that in the comments for everybody else to see. It is the absolute bare minimum. I think it's less than $1 if you want to support the show and all the work that we do on the channel. James, thank you, mate, as always, for an awesome little recap of our time challenge, a little look back at all of our tutorials and a little breakdown of them. And yeah, it's awesome chat. We'll see you guys again next week for another episode of The Sketch Wave. Bye-bye for now.